Chapter 7. Norman sat in his kitchenette, dismally regarding the slim brass wheel spinning once more upon its tabletop mountings. Over in the corner alcove, his other self sat lifeless and staring, a gaping hole in his chest. Norman swung his leg over the kitchen chair and leaned his arms upon its worm-eaten back. The first run had not been altogether a roaring success. If O'Malley's bike had not chosen to intervene and trip the robot into the street, there seemed little doubt that it would have killed O'Malley there and then, merely to retrieve the tobacco from his pocket. Norman chewed upon his lip. It was a regular Frankenstein's monster, that one. Not what he'd had in mind at all. Placid, pseudo-shopkeeper he wanted, not psychotic android on the rampage. He would have to disconnect all the DMAX circuits and pep up the old goodwill to mankind modules. Possibly it was simply the case that the robot had been a little over-enthusiastic. After all, it had had his interests at heart. Norman shuddered. Omally had got away with the tobacco, and Hairy Dave had charged him 50 quid to shore up the front of the shop and screw a temporary door to the splintered frame. The robot had not been in service more than a couple of hours, and it was already bankrupting him. 50 quid for a half-ounce of Gordon. And what if Omally decided to sue, or more likely to exact revenge? It didn't bear thinking of. He'd have to go round to the Swan later and apologise. Stand Omally a few pints of consolation. More expense. The harassed shopkeeper climbed from his chair and sought out a quart of homemade sprout wine from the bottle rack beneath the sink. At length, the Memorial Library clock chimed 5:30 p.m. in the distance, and upon the Swan's doorstep stood two bedraggled figures who, like Norman, had the drowning of their sorrows very much to the forefront of their respective minds. Neville, the part-time barman, drew the polished bolts and swung open the famous door. "By Magog," said the pagan barkeep, "whatever's happened to you two? Should I call an ambulance?" Pooley shook his head. "Merely drawed the ales." With many a backwards glance, Neville lumbered heavily away to the pumps. "But what's happened to you both? Your eye, John, and Jim, your sleeves." Neville pushed 2 brimming pints across the counter towards the straining hands of his 2 patrons. "We were mugged," said Omally, who was finding it hard to come to terms with the concept of defeat at the hands of a humble shopkeeper. 10 of them, Pooley added. He had once read of a mugger's victim being carried into a pub and revived with free ale. Neville had also read of it and took up a glass to polish. "We live in troubled times," he said profoundly. 10 and 6, please." Omally drew his boot away from his bruised ankle and pulled out several pound notes. Neville, who had never before seen the Irishman handling money in public, was anxious to see if they were the real McCoy. The wrinkled relic John handed him smelt a bit pawny, but it did have a watermark. Neville rang up no sale and obligingly short-changed his customer. Omally slung the pennies into his trouser pocket without even checking them. "Mugged then, is it?" Neville felt almost guilty. "Did your best, civilians." "Did we?" Pooley raised his scorched palm and made chopping movements. "The blackguards will think twice about molesting the folk of Brentford again, I can tell you." "I see Norman's having his shop front done up," said old Pete, who had sneaked in hard upon the heels of the 2 warriors. Omally spluttered into his beer. "Is that a fact?" said he. "Had his shop front mugged, so I hear." "Give that gentleman a large dark rum," said Omally. The ancient accepted his prize and slunk away to a side table with much malicious chuckling. Omally grudgingly paid up and joined Pooley, who had taken to hiding in a suitably darkened corner. "I shan't be able to live with this," said John, seating himself. "That old one knows already. It'll be all over the parish by the morning." "But Norman," said Pooley, "I still can't quite believe it. Norman wouldn't hurt a spider, and by God his shop gives lodging to enough." "A lover of the insect kingdom he may be, but let humankind beware. The shopkeeper has finally lost his marbles. He took it out on me as though violence was going out of fashion." Jim sighed. "This is a day I should certainly choose to forget. We have both paid dearly for our greed." John nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose there's lessons to be learned from it. We've certainly learned ours the hard way." "Talking of lessons, I think your homework has just arrived." Jim pointed over O'Malley's shoulder to where Norman now stood, squinting about the bar. John sank low in his high-backed chair. "Has he seen me?" he whispered. Pooley nodded. "I'm afraid so. He's coming over." "When you hit him, go for his beak. Ignore the groin." I'm not going to hit him. This is nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with you. You started it. You and your money-making wheel. Evening, gents, said Norman. Evening to you, old friend, said Pooley, smiling sweetly. Omally rummaged in his pockets and brought out a crumpled packet of cigarette papers and a somewhat banjoed half-ounce of tobacco. I never smoked it, he said. You can have it back if you still want it. Norman held up his hand, which made Omally flinch painfully. No, I've come to apologise. I really don't know what came over me to lose my temper like that. I've been working too hard lately. I've a lot of worries. It's no permanent damage done, I trust. I'm still in a state of shock. Omally sensed possibilities. And I'm all over. I suspect a fracture here and there. I'll be off work a good while, I shouldn't wonder. Norman nodded good-naturedly. Omally would be wanting his pound of flesh. Better get it over with in one go. Might buy you a drink? He asked. You might, said Omally, and we'll see where it leads. If you could manage one for my companion also, it would not go unappreciated. Norman smiled. He wondered whether or not to ask Pooley where the sleeves of his jacket were, but he presupposed the answer to be of a somewhat poignant nature, evoking images of such hardship and tragedy as to morally oblige the asker to purchase many further pints. I'll get the round in then, said Norman, departing to the bar. 1 pint and 1/2 ounce up, said John bleakly. What profit the day, I ask you? Perk it up, John. It can only get better, surely. Pooley now sighted old Pete, hobbling purposefully towards them. He'll possibly not. Where's my bed, then? The ancient asked, prodding O'Malley's bruised shoulder-blade with his stick. I've brought the money. Money? John did not recall mentioning a figure. How much did you bring? 20 quid. 20 quid? Omally buried his face in his hands. It's enough, isn't it? You said it was an antique. I think 20 quid's a fair price if it's a good one. So where's my bed? What bed? Asked Norman, who was bringing up the drinks. Omally said he had an antique bedstead to sell me. I want to see it. The muggers took it, said Jim Pooley helpfully. Omally, who was just coming to terms with a £10 down payment for an antique bedstead at present being refurbished by mythical upholsterers, looked up at him in horror. Sorry, said Jim, shrugging innocently. What muggers? Asked Norman. The 10 who blacked his eye. Or did you say there were 12, John? Oh, said Norman, stroking his chin. Come to think of it, I did see a gang of bully boys pushing an antique bed along down by the half-acre. Thought it odd at the time. Right evil-looking bunch they were. Wouldn't have dared tackle them myself. No fight of me. Bleh, snarled old Pete. You're all barking mad. Turning upon his heel, he muttered a few well-chosen obscenities and shuffled away. Thanks, said Omally, when the ancient was beyond earshot. I suppose that calls a square. Good. Norman passed the 2 newly retired bed salesmen their pints. Then if you'll pardon me, I think I will go and have a word with old Pete. I've an old brass bed in my lock-up he might be interested in. The money will go some way towards meeting the cost of a new shop door. So all's well that ends well, eh? Every cloud's a silver lining and a trouble shared is a friend indeed. With the briefest of goodbyes, Norman left the 2 stunned drinkers staring after him. After a short, yet very painful silence, Omally spoke. You and your ruddy big mouth, said he. Pooley turned up his ruined palms helplessly. Still, he said, your reputation is saved at least. You buffoon! There's no reputation worth more than £5, and a man who has £5 to credit needs no reputation whatsoever. Ah, well, let's look on the bright side. I think I can say, without any fear of contradiction, that nothing else can possibly happen to us today. It is of some small consequence to note that had Jim been possessed of that rare gift of foresight, even to the degree of a few short hours, he would certainly not have made that particular, ill-considered, and most inaccurate remark.